Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It's Tuesday morning, May 29th, and I have a special education program on today. Today we're going to be talking with Holly Swanson, and later we'll be joined by Alex Newman. But we are going to be talking about how our education system has been dismantled over the last, well, really 100 years, if not even longer, by the progressive socialists that have been in charge of the whole system for that long. And we originally were scheduled to have Charlotte Isertbeat on the call as well, but Charlotte had a, well, let's say a family matter come up that was very important she needed to deal with. But I have some comments from Charlotte, and her comment to me was, please make sure that the listeners understand that this is not a Democrat-Republican issue. The progressives of both parties have been destroying our education system for a very long time. And she's absolutely correct. I like to remind our listeners that the very first progressive socialist president was Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt was considered by many a hero of American history. Well, when you read a little bit more about Theodore Roosevelt and you realize what his political leanings were, he was certainly no protector of liberty, and he was the first progressive socialist president. He actually called himself progressive socialist. So this has been going on for over 100 years. With that, Holly, welcome to the program, and thank you for being here. You're a very special friend and a very special guest.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
Well, I'd like for you to give our listeners a little bit of your background, who you represent, some of the things that you've been dealing with, and then let's get into the weeds and start really fleshing the bandits out of the weeds with this socialist group that are destroying our education system.
Absolutely. Just very briefly, back in the late 80s, I, like many Americans, were paying a little more attention to what was going on as far as environmental issues. There was a big push in the late 80s for more wilderness areas and the idea to stop logging and endangered species, that direction. Well, depending on who you spoke with, depending on who I spoke with, you could get a completely different perspective on the issue of environmental protection. and caring about the environment like we all do, I wanted to know more, so I started attending environmental conferences, reading what I could read, anything I could get my hands on regarding what was going on with this issue. I wanted to know more. The more environmental conferences I attended, the more concerned I became about the political agenda attached to the environmental movement. As I picked up information from the Socialist Party, Earth First, the Green Party, I didn't understand the connection there because the environmental movement has always been alleged to be nonpartisan, and everything the environmental movement was advocating was alleged to be nonpartisan. What I discovered was the Green Party agenda, the agenda of the political Green parties, which started in Europe, was actually directly aligned with the goals the environmental movement was advocating. And from that point forward, I started literally, just as your program is titled, connecting the dots between the environmental movement's biased political agenda and the Green Party. And those came together, and I have documented how this really started in the 70s to be using the environmental cause as a smokescreen to implement the communist agenda of the Green Party. And education was a absolute critical part of the plan to indoctrinate America's children to believe that they had to submit to this political agenda, had to become activists for this political agenda in order to survive. And our schools have been literally taken over by the environmental movement. It started out with Earth Day and some pretty innocent reduce, reuse, and recycle themes, which we would all agree with. And then it progressed to more activism and more activism in the classroom until what we have right now is a system in public education which is designed from kindergarten through the university to produce students who have conformed to the green agenda and are ready to go out and use their vote to impose that agenda on the American people. And again, that agenda mirrors communism, lock, stock, and barrel. And we have a problem that we need to solve, which is to get this agenda out of our schools and do it immediately.
Well,
just to
Holly,
say, when you said
you're absolutely right about the communist background for the Green Movement. I mean, a lot of people have referred to the Green Movement as watermelon movement, and I think we even had a radio show where we called it the stoplight movement. The Reds are taking over by using the Greens, and we're too yellow to do anything about it.
Yes, absolutely. And it is the watermelon movement. It's green on the outside, red on the inside, and it has been so eloquently and very effectively presented that, as I said, the alleged nonpartisan agenda of the environmental movement is anything but nonpartisan, and that we really have to break through that assumption in order to start solving our problems. Look at it as a partisan agenda and start dealing with it as such.
Yes, and not just partisan in the traditional American sense of
right.
Republican Democrat, because frankly, we've really got a one-party system, whether we want to admit it or not. We have a system in place right now that takes turn playing good cop, bad cop, and they take turns moving us to the left. They just do it at a speed that most people don't recognize. And the bottom line is it's a communist movement, and you're right on the money with that, Holly. Your book, Training for Treason, is a really excellent book to describe just exactly what is behind the sustainability movement, and we'll certainly get into that later in the broadcast as well. Tell our listeners about some of the things that you've been seeing happen over the last 20 years. Kind of build a chronology, if you would, as you have, let's say, became more and more aware of what was going on with the Green Movement and how it really was rooted in socialism or communism.
Absolutely. Just to begin with, as I had said, I had attended environmental conferences and I was reading both sides of the debate on different issues. But what is important to note is during those environmental conferences, some of the individuals there, the leaders of the environmental movement, including leaders of the AFL-CIO, which were, the message there was intertwined into the environmental goals. And the intent was to use issues like endangered species to put the logging industry out of business, use issues like endangered species and water regulation to put ranchers and farmers out of business. This was surprising to me because, naive as I was at the time in the late 80s, early 90s, the environmental movement had been presented so much as the good guy in the white hat, you would not think when you look behind the scenes that there was a absolutely sinister plan, for lack of a better way to describe it, to put people out of business. And the more I researched, the more I discovered that this was a common theme through the educational movement as well. And when you look at some of the beginnings of this, there was a document which we've discussed before called the Blueprint for Survival. The Blueprint for Survival was written by 3 or 4 people, and it was written in 1972, and it was designed to be handed to the delegates at the first UN Environmental Summit held in 1972. Now, that, of course, was designed to influence the United Nations agenda on the environment. Also, very importantly to note, is that document became, the Blueprint for Survival became the go-to text for the environmental movement. Many of the ideas that came out of the blueprint were advocated and promoted by the environmental movement in the United States, big time, as well as different places throughout the world. It's also vitally important to understand the connection between the blueprint and the environmental movement, but also the blueprint and one of the authors of the blueprint became the founding fathers, basically, of the Green Party in Europe. And the blueprint became the foundational document for the Green Party. So you can see a direct connection now between the environmental movement, now dubbed the Green Movement, and the Green Party. There's a direct connection because the agenda is the same. And right now, what the environmental movement is pushing regarding climate change aligns directly with the goals of the Green Party. And so you see all of these pieces coming together. And now what we see is climate change education is not about science and presenting both sides of a scientific concern, such as climate change. What we see now happening with the green groups, from the Earth Day Network to the Sierra Club, is to support banning any materials which question man-made climate change. So what you're talking about is only using materials provided by environmental groups and like-minded groups to train, teach, indoctrinate America's children to believe man-made climate change is real. There's absolutely no debate, and therefore we would graduate students ready to use their vote, all our new voters, to implement the communist agenda behind climate change. And what it boils down to is you're using public education from kindergarten through the university simply to politically indoctrinate our students, use our students, and dictate public policy from the classroom. And this is so very important for all of us to understand. The environmental movement is dictating public policy from the classroom by indoctrinating, politically indoctrinating, brainwashing, and training America's children to believe that they need to use their vote to implement the agenda they are learning in the classroom, and that's education for sustainability, climate change, social justice. They're all tied together. And where we have come in the last 20 years is from a politically neutral public education, which is the American standard. The American standard of a politically neutral public education is an essential safeguard to free thought, individual freedom, and the democratic process. And what we are seeing right now is a politically biased public education that is specifically designed, just like the communist model of education, to take the child and train the child, brainwash the child, so they will be controllable, manageable, and will submit to the communist agenda as adults. And that's really, when you look at where we've come since the 70s to where we are right now, we have absolutely got to stop the communist model of education from continuing to suffocate our schools, to demand that teachers teach communism as an environmental goal. We need to address that before it's too late. And what you said about having really not a two-party system anymore is true, because you have absolutely people on both sides of the aisle pushing this or just closing their eyes to the political indoctrination in our schools. And I would say when we come full circle to where we are right now, what's gone on in the last 20 to 30 years, we are at a point where the political indoctrination of America's children with a communist agenda is a matter of national security, and we need to address it as such. It is abuse. It is eco-child abuse to do this to children. It is not education. It is indoctrination. And as a matter of national security, we need to address this on the federal level because we have a national issue here, a national problem. And then we need to return control to local schools rather than having federal programs that dictate partly what our children are learning in school. And the Education for Sustainability movement has gained millions of dollars to go ye forth and implement this all across the nation. And you have also, as I said, the environmental movement, the Earth Day Network, using Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month to impose this on the children. And it's all under the pretense that we're saving the Earth when it truly has nothing to do with saving the Earth. If it had anything to do with saving the Earth, first of all, you wouldn't be using children for political gain. Second of all, you'd be looking at both sides of the scientific issue to make a decision, not banning scientific evidence which would lead you to make an informed decision. If you're really concerned about making good quality decisions, then you look at both sides of the issue. So we're in a very serious time, and the only way we're going to solve this problem is to address it forthright and stay on it until we get green politics out of our schools and communism out of our schools.
Holly, that's extremely well said. And what I want to make our listeners aware of is that we didn't win the Cold War. Whether we realize it or not, we've been suckered. We've been sucked in. We thought we won the Cold War, but in fact, what we did was the communists went underground. The same people who have been attacking this country for, really over 100 years, or certainly at least 100 years, went underground. And Yuri Andropov, who was the Soviet premier between Brezhnev and Mikhail Gorbachev, put together a plan. It was called the Andropov Plan, and that was actually, he was the head of the Russian KGB at the time. And he said, we will have a change in strategy toward the West. And this was implemented in 1982 under his tutorship. But what it said was basically we would create communism worldwide through gradualism instead of direct confrontation, because they knew they couldn't win the war on a strictly materialistic basis, on a ideological basis. They could not win the war by direct confrontation. Mm-hmm. So they went underground. And I have an interesting quote by Mikhail Gorbachev, and this was a special report in 1996 on the Wildlands Project, its War on Mankind, and it was, quote, the threat of environmental crisis will be the international disaster key that will unlock the new world order, unquote. That was Mikhail Gorbachev. We need to understand that when Mikhail Gorbachev was deposed as a Russian premier in 1990-91, he basically at that point, he was given millions and millions of dollars by the tax-exempt foundations, primarily the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, as well as a number of others. And he moved to the Presidio, which is one of the premier military bases in San Francisco area. And they turned it into now a Center for Sustainability. And President George Herbert Walker Bush, who I think was one of the worst of the New World Order, brought Mikhail Gorbachev to the Presidio, gave him a residence there, and that was where he initially, with American money through tax-exempt foundations, created Green Cross. And Green Cross is considered the most eminent of the environmental organizations worldwide. Okay, Holly, with that, I wanted to give you a break, but that's the lead-in for you to talk about just exactly how the environmental movement has really taken over the school systems in our country.
Absolutely, and just right along with what you are saying, when understanding that Gorbachev knew where he was going, papers, when he was supposedly disposed as the communist premier, papers for the Gorbachev Foundation had already been filed with the California Secretary of State. So he knew he was headed for California. And so the Gorbachev Foundation, Green Cross International, working with environmental groups, they embraced him as basically one of their spokespeople, embraced his ideas, and as Gorbachev moved forward as an environmental leader with all his millions to back him up, one of the things that occurred is he became the co-author of the Earth Charter. Now, the Earth Charter is all about social justice, environmental protection, and aligns perfectly, really, with the goals of the Green Party. Many of the goals of the blueprint are incorporated in there. It aligns also with the Constitution of the USSR, 1977, I believe was the one that I quoted in the book. And the bottom line is Gorbachev's Earth Charter is designed to become the supreme law of the land. If it was adopted by the United States, it would become the supreme law of our land, and so much for the U.S. Constitution. It would supplant the U.S. Constitution. That is so important to understand because nearly every major environmental group and most of the major education for sustainability groups have endorsed the Earth Charter, the Sierra Club, the National Wildlife Federation, the Natural Resource Defense Council, Second Nature, John Kerry's organization, and more have endorsed the Earth Charter. So there is a direct alignment between what the Gorbachev Green Cross, Gorbachev Foundation wants to accomplish with the Earth Charter, and the Earth Day Network is a partner in the Earth Charter, which means they are full-blown using the influence of the Earth Day Network to impose this charter, these ideas, the Green Party ideas, in our schools and on our children. That is the direct link from where Gorbachev left the Soviet Union, and no, we didn't win the Cold War. The communists just figured out another way to get the job done. So you have Gorbachev in the United States, you have Gorbachev involved with the Earth Charter, you have the Earth Charter reflecting Green Party goals, and in fact, the Green Party itself, I believe it was in 1992, in the Green Party program, it says we must advance the goals of the Earth Charter. So it is all connected, and it is where it ends with our schools, with the Earth Day Network being a partner in the Earth Charter, and all the major environmental groups being partners with the Earth Day Network. It is directly right there. You can see it very clearly. That's what we need to realize, is this is a plan that is being executed. The idea is to take over our schools and train our children basically to be against our form of government, to be against our free enterprise system, to be against private property rights, to be against private property, to be against the accumulation of wealth, and to be for a communist form of government where everything is controlled by the government rather than having individual freedom. So it all comes full circle, and right now our children are in the crosshairs.
You know, Holly, they are, and the thing that a lot of people don't really understand is how these tax-exempt foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers, and all these other tax-exempt, and that, now understand by tax-exempt, that means that we're paying for them to be able to shelter money so that they can use that money in political campaigns, in social engineering campaigns that are destroying our country. So we're paying for all these tax-exempt foundations and non-governmental organizations to change our entire societal structure.
Mm-hmm. And they're doing it, they're very effective at what they're doing and using their monies in that way. And again, it's part of the structure of a nonprofit is they're supposed to be nonpartisan. So it's very important to understand as we tackle this issue that the tax-exempt status of these groups, Second Nature, the Sierra Club, and what have you, should not be allowed because they're definitely advancing a partisan agenda that mirrors Green Party goals and communism, is Green Party goals and communism. And in fact, recently, in an article actually on Earth Day that came out titled The Connection Between Russia and Two Green Groups Fighting Fracking in the United States. And this article basically points out that the Sierra Club Foundation, the Natural Resource Defense Council, received millions of dollars in grants from groups through Russia. So there's a collusion going on there. Then I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood, don't quote me, but somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 million as I'm looking through this article right now, something like $15 million that was funneled to the Sierra Club and the Natural Resource Defense Council and other groups, so through Russia to these groups so they could fight fracking in the United States, which ethically that shouldn't even occur. What do you think?
Oh, I agree.
So we have a tremendous amount more and more that is coming out to prove, as you're talking about, these tax-exempt foundations are using our money to advance a communist agenda in the United States, and that's one arm of certainly the environmental movement and a way they are advancing this and having the money to do so. And also, right back to education, we pay for public education. We pay for it, and we're paying for our own demise right now. So we have to get a handle on this and stop that.
Okay, Holly, we've got to move to a commercial break, but keep that thought, and we'll pick it up on the other side of the break.
Sounds good.
This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today I have Holly Swanson on the show, and we will be joined in the second hour by Alex Newman, and we are talking about and it isn't education anymore, the indoctrination of our children in the public school system today. Before we get back into the discussion, I want to remind our listeners that we also have a couple of other great programs that are on. Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday comes on at the same time as this show on Wednesday. And Debbie has a terrific group of people talking about the same subjects that we cover, different guests, but same subjects that we cover during our Connecting the Dots show. It's important that we support her radio program. Also following our radio show today and later through the week is a gentleman by the name of Jeff Bennett. He has a show called Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz, and that is a terrific program as well. I ask our listeners, please support this network. Please support our sponsors. We are in a fundraiser right now to finish raising the funds to put our satellite uplink back up for this network. If we can do that, we literally will be able to reach millions and millions and millions of new listeners all over North America. So please help us in that venture, because it's important that this word, that this message gets out to the rest of North America, not just the United States, but North America and then the world. So, okay, Holly, back to you. We were talking about how the Green parties and the Green movement have literally hijacked education. I've got a comment on that too. The idea of environmentalism being the let's say the concept that would unite the world into a common cause for a common world government was not an old idea. That came out in the 1960s through the Club of Rome, which is a group of the same kind of people that make up the Bilderbergers and some of these other high-powered groups that pretty much do rule the world. And at that conference they had at Rockefeller's mansion in Italy, they came up with the concept of environmentalism being the one common theme that had the power to unite the world and to reduce the consumption of natural resources and to be able to control people. And the book that came out after that conference was called Limits to Growth, and that came out of the Club of Rome. And that really is what started that whole movement in 1970, 71, 72. Okay, Holly, back to you. I've just given you a few little seeds there that you could kind of start planting for us.
Absolutely, because this is a plan. The ideas that you're talking about with the Club of Rome and Limits to Growth, all these pieces were part of laying the groundwork to get to where we are today. It's not happenstance. These ideas didn't fall out of the sky. It's part of a strategic plan to undermine the principles of our nation, undermine our freedoms, undermine the Constitution, and use the environment to get the job done. And it goes right back what you're talking about, again, part of the plan. In 1989, the Green Party program stated specifically in 1989 that this urgency, they're talking about the greenhouse effect. The Green Party is talking about the greenhouse effect and says in their party program, this urgency, along with all other green issues and themes it interrelates, makes confronting the greenhouse a powerful organizing tool. And here's the key. Survival is highly motivating and may help us in building a mass movement that will lead to large-scale political and societal change in a very short time. So the Greens, the Green Party, was very well aware of using survival as a strategic tool with the environmental movement to advance this agenda. And that's exactly what you just pointed out. Survival as a tool to not only scare the general population into compliance, but to scare our children into submitting to this agenda. And right along those lines, back just addressing just a little bit, right along to what we were talking about before the break, and the nonprofits, the NGO groups, I wanted to go back to what I had mentioned just to follow up on it. And the article I had mentioned about the Russians funding environmental groups in the U.S. was from the Daily Signal, and you can probably go to dailysignal.com to look it up. The title is the connection between Russia and two green groups fighting fracking in the U.S. Came out on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2018. And just a couple of the quotes from the article state, two environmental advocacy groups that successfully lobbied against fracking in New York each received more than $10 million in grants from a foundation in California that got financial support from a Bermuda company. Congressional investigators linked to the Russians. Public documents show. Goes on to say the environmental groups, Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Sierra Club Foundation received millions of dollars in grants from the San Francisco-based Sea Change Foundation. It goes on to say, from 2010 through 2015, the Sierra Club Foundation received more than $18 million from the Sea Change Foundation, and the Natural Resource Defense Council received more than $15 million. So that's a lot of money being funneled through, laundered into the environmental groups. That's a tremendous amount of money, and they've linked it to Russia, which is a serious concern. Would you say?
Well, not just that, Holly, but the fact that the Russians are one of the biggest petroleum and natural gas producers in the world.
Right.
And fracking was a definite concern to them because they don't want energy independent United States of America. And that's one of the things that Trump's been working on that I really applaud, is the fact that we are becoming energy independent, but we couldn't do that without fracking. So obviously there is a real movement here to make sure that we don't advance economically, and certainly that can be tied directly to all this green stuff.
Exactly, and that is a very definite, important consideration. One other part of this article that I'll just read is Representative Lamar Smith, R., Texas, chairman of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, sent a letter in June to the Treasury Secretary saying allegations of Russian financial support for U.S. environmental groups, quote, are ripe for an investigation by the Treasury Department. And that's exactly what needs to happen, because where the monies come from and where the monies go make a big difference in the environmental movement's ability to continue to take over education and continue to have the programs that they have, which are designed to undermine our constitutional principles, private property rights, and literally our free enterprise system as well. So it all goes together. It's not something that, again, as I said, fell out of the sky. When you look at all the facts and you connect those dots again, Dan, you have a political agenda to impose communism in the United States. Political indoctrination of our children is a primary, fundamental part of that strategy. It is critical that we understand that, because for some, depending on where you live, maybe you are not directly impacted or have not yet been directly impacted by environmental regulations. But whether it's smart growth or smart cities or the whole idea of sustainability in your city, you will be impacted. And it's vitally important to understand what the goals are, what the political goals are, not only so you can identify them in how they impact your life or your business, but most of all, and I do say most of all, to understand what our children are learning, because I think it was Stalin that said, so go the children, so go the nation. And if we lose our children to communist indoctrination, we lose our nation to communist rule. It's only a matter of time.
No, you're absolutely right. And I want to have a quote here by Norman Thomas. He was the six-time presidential candidate, Socialist Party of America and the Communist Party USA. He died in 1968, so obviously this goes back a lot of years. And this is a quote by him. Quote, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened, unquote. That was clear back in 1958 or something like that, that statement was made. That shows how long this has been working. That shows how long this program has been in effect. Holly, tell our listeners too how all these different education programs that are now throughout the United States, and I know you target specifically Portland, Oregon, how they are promoting things that are openly socialist now. They don't even try to hide it.
Absolutely. You have to peel the layer back, but when you do, for example, in 2016, the Portland Public School District, public school system, adopted a resolution which was to the purpose of the resolution, and I'll just read this statement from them. Portland Public Schools will abandon the use of any adopted text material that is found to express doubt about the severity of the climate crisis or its root in human activities. So, from preschool through high school, Portland, Oregon, 49,000 students affected. The Portland schools have abandoned the use of any text materials that question any scientific fact, that question man-made global warming. So those students right now are learning one-sided. They're being trained to believe one set of ideas regarding the climate crisis and how severe it is. So scare them into compliance. In addition, when you look at what the resolution states, part of the resolution is to redefine our economies and call for an end to the fossil fuel era. Redefine our economy and call for an end to the fossil fuel era. This is being taught under the auspice, the pretense of alleged nonpartisan environmental education regarding climate change. It could not be further from the truth. Redefine our economy is a political goal. End the fossil fuel era is a political goal. And if you train the children to believe we must end the fossil fuel era, then that is what they will believe. And it's just brainwashing, pure and simple. And it's dictating, again, I go back, dictating public policy from the classroom. And when you think about what does it mean, and this is for everybody to take seriously, just take a breath. What does it mean to end the fossil fuel era? It means anything related to petroleum. Well, it doesn't matter if it's your weed eater or your boat or an airplane or the family car. Ending the fossil fuel era means no gas for any of those items. Now, how many people, whether it be farmers or, somebody mowing their lawn, can go out and buy an electric mower? It's not meaning that you couldn't afford or make a choice to do that at some point down the line if you chose to do that. What you're talking about is teaching this to the children so it will be mandated. And it's all based on the idea of climate change and what we need to do, what the environmental movement says we need to avoid environmental disaster. And what the environmental movement says we need to do to avoid environmental disaster is to change our economy and the free market system, just as starters, and end the fossil fuel era and create a sustainable future. That all sounds wonderful, but we need to know what the stakes are and what the goals are and apply it to our lives. If you remove fossil fuels from the American economy and from people's lives, even if you do it gradually over the next 10 or 20 years, where are you going to be? You're going to be exactly where the Greens wanted to be back in 1989, declaring the end of fossil fuels to solve the greenhouse effect. That was one of the goals, and that people could get around with public transportation, bicycles, or skateboards. Now, that sounded really ridiculous in 1989, but look where we are in 2018. We have court cases that are suing the Trump administration to end the fossil fuel era, and of course this is being presented as something that they're doing for the children, but it is actually a way to, and as I stated in the other book, Set Up and Sold Out, find out what green really means, that came out in the early 90s. was that the environmental groups intended to use our system to bring down our system. In other words, make control possible by making control legal. And what you have seen through endangered species and through these court cases is exactly that. Make the ability to end the fossil fuel era possible by making it legal, setting a legal mandate. So there is so much to this. In addition, how does it affect people's personal lives? One of the other goals within the Portland resolution, and this is our school system, and again, as I state this, it's important to understand the Earth Day Network, which represents basically every environmental group there is, almost, anyway, is endorsing this resolution, the Portland resolution, to be spread nationwide. The National Education Association has also endorsed and asked their members to support implementing this resolution nationwide. So you need to pay attention to what's going on in the schools in your backyard, because here's the point. In that resolution, it calls for all students, not one or two, all 49,000 students in the Portland school system to see themselves as environmental justice activists and social justice activists. That's political activism in the classroom, mandated by the school system. And what does social justice mean? This is where it's very important to understand. Social justice, as defined by one of the leading Education for Sustainability curriculum development groups, is social justice is the movement toward achieving equality in the distribution of goods and wealth among all groups in society. The movement toward achieving equality in the distribution of goods and wealth among all groups in society. That definition matches the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the CIA, definition of a communist form of government. So you have the Portland Public School system advocating all students become social justice activists, reaching for this goal, and this goal is not stated in the resolution. This is an Education for Sustainability goal of what social justice means, and that matches the CIA definition of communism. It's very, very clear. We're seeing teaching communism in Portland public schools and elsewhere across the United States. Social justice is now being promoted in the universities as a degree program. And when you understand what social justice means, it's simply using our public school system to produce a communist future for the United States by brainwashing and indoctrinating our future leaders, our future political leaders, and on every other aspect of our society to use their vote, to be activists, to impose this agenda on unsuspecting Americans. And that's why everybody listening needs to come up to speed on this, because when you can see it, you understand it, you can do something about it, and we certainly need to start with our schools.
Well, Holly, you're absolutely right on that. And the thing that we need to understand is how deep this pool runs, because, your comments about how this is all part of really a system designed by the communists to control people.
Yeah.
It takes everything that we own, everything that we believe is being morphed into a totally different system through our education system. And what we see happening, and your comments about how this affects agriculture, it affects communities, it affects everyone, is to see how our society will be changed from a society of free people who have the ability to make change and do it in the right way to a society that is totally controlled. And we will be living literally in human kennels. We'll be living in big mega cities that will be where all of mankind is going to be housed, and all the green areas, all the wilderness areas around these big cities will be supposedly turned into pre-Columbian wilderness and very lightly used agricultural land. Most of agriculture, most of farming will be handled by big agribusiness. The big corporations that control agriculture will literally eliminate small family farms and all these other really individual enterprises. And all I can say is that this world that they envision is the antithesis of what our founders envisioned with this nation. And it is really something that if people would just wake up and look and see the world around you and understand that they plan to take all your wealth, all your property, and they fully plan to redistribute that wealth around the world and destroy our society, and we will be a society equally poor with the rest of the world. That's exactly what their vision is, Holly, and that's and the fact that they're teaching that to our kids, it's unimaginable that our parents have allowed that to happen. Why have our parents been asleep that long, and how can we get that turned around?
Well, I believe as we look at this, what the Greens have been very successful in doing, in marketing and packaging their message as nonpartisan, alleged nonpartisan, not affiliated with any political party. They have, they, meaning the Green movement, and has presented their ideas, again, as nonpartisan. So, whether it be in a congressional debate or a debate down at the library, the idea is it's all being done for the environment, and all the scientific facts and all the goals that are presented as nonpartisan, when in reality they line directly up with communism and line directly up with Green Party goals. Because this movement, the Green movement, has presented themselves as a non-political group, they have been successful in basically blindsiding the American people. One of the ways, and it's essential, is to use Training for Treason, the book, use the facts to show our friends, our family, our pastors, our political leaders that this is a partisan movement. This is a political movement. It is not nonpartisan. And when we understand if it is a political movement with a political agenda that lines with the Green Party, people can start to see the communist agenda behind it. And that's what we have to do. That's one of the first things we have to do, is help our friends, our family, our neighbors, and our political leaders hold their feet to the fire that this is a political movement advancing a specific political agenda that goes with communism and Green Party goals. It is harmful to our nation. It goes against the founding principles. It goes against our whole setup that the founding fathers put together, including an anti-God agenda that goes with that, teaching humanism in the classroom as a very definite aside. So we need to realize, and we need to work at getting this message out. And that is what the book Training for Treason is for. That is what the We Choose Freedom campaign, I'm the director of that campaign. It is a national campaign to address the issue of political indoctrination in our schools as a issue of national security. And we need to focus on that, because once the American people can see what's happening to their children, they can see what's happening to them. And it takes away the idea that there's some boogeyman out there and pins it directly to where it's coming from, the Green Movement, exactly. The Green Party.
Okay, Holly, we're moving into our break, but keep that thought, and on the other side of the hour, we'll be joined by Alex Newman as well.
Perfect.
This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and my guest today is Holly Swanson, and we will be joined in this hour by Alex Newman. Alex isn't quite on the call yet, but that's okay. We're finishing up on some thoughts that Holly had. I want to also mention to our listeners that Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday is on at the same time on Wednesdays as the Connecting the Dots show. And I ask our listeners, please tune in and listen to Debbie's show. She does a terrific job in really explaining many of the things that we're talking about in our show and amplifying with different guests. I also want to mention that Jeff Bennett's got a show on immediately after my Connecting the Dots show, and Jeff is doing a terrific job with a program called Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz. I want to mention that we are in a fundraising campaign for the Micro Effect Radio Network to get our satellite uplink in place, which will add literally millions of listeners if we can get that uplink in place. Please support this network and also support our advertisers. It all adds up. It all helps to get us closer to our goal. We're very, very close to having that goal met. So we need your support. We need you to jump on board and help with that effort. It will make all the difference in the world. Also, we're going to be doing a ticket giveaway for the Red Pill Expo. We were in the process right now of putting together the promotion on that, and it will be a contest to allow several people to be able to pick up the general admission tickets to the Red Pill Expo free of charge, and this will be tied in with a promotion program for the network. So please, folks, listen to this network, support this network, and work hard to make sure that we get our word out to more and more people literally all over the world, because this is an important message. Okay, Holly, I'll get back to you. You were talking about how the school system through the NGOs and how innocuous some of these programs sound until you start peeling back the layers.
That's right.
And what an amazing story some of these environmental groups really have, because I know some of these groups and they've got really good people working there who really believe in this cause, and they've just been completely brainwashed in they're actually selling.
Absolutely, because it is so, the way it's been presented, billions of dollars have been put into this promotion. A lot of psychology and strategy has gone into making the environment the central organizing principle mindset, which is what Al Gore had talked about. And we all love the environment, so it's natural. We come from a position of being good stewards, waste not, want not. So it's something that plays into our heartstrings naturally. But it's very important to understand when there's deception, we've also got to be strong enough to see it. And when you talk about deception, for example, the Education for Sustainability movement, one of the main groups in that movement is Second Nature. Second Nature was founded by Senator John Kerry in 1993. The purpose of Second Nature, and I quote, is humans are guided by a whole set of beliefs and values, and those come from culture, from religion, from social, economic, and political structure. We need to change all of those. So the purpose of John Kerry, former Secretary of State John Kerry, his environmental group, his educational group, Second Nature, is to use education to change America's culture, to change America's society, to change America's economy, to change our religious base, and our political structure. So that in and of itself says the goal is to change our political structure. From what to what? Right now, we have a political structure based on the Constitution, and from the documentation, which I have put together with Second Nature and others have put together, it is to change it to a communist form of government. If your goal is to help the environment, you don't necessarily need a new government system. And so we need to understand when we look at the environmental movement and we look at environmental education, and there's all kinds of documentation to back this up, that we are dealing with a communist movement. The environmental movement is a front. It is a communist movement. We need to start looking at all policies from that standpoint. Take the emotion away and look at the politics, look at the agenda, look at the one-sided science, and start understanding we're being played. And the only way we're going to solve it is to look at things from the political standpoint with which the end game is. It matters. What is the goal? And when you can understand what the goal is, then you can understand how you're being manipulated to buy into that goal. So we need to understand that in our schools, what is at risk is individual freedom and free thought, the democratic process. If you're mass producing new voters who are going to vote for communism, you're not going to have our democratic process in place much longer. And it will result in a single-party rule, which is a communist rule, a communist model of government. So we need to look at those goals, add it all up, realize what's happening to our children in schools, and absolutely focus on getting green politics, communism out of our schools, getting the environmental movement out of our schools, because the environmental movement started imposing their agenda on our children with Earth Day in the 70s, and it's just continued to where now sustainability and climate education, climate literacy, all these points are now a focal point of the school day. So our children are being indoctrinated, and the way we turn that around is to all work together to get the word out. And the reason that our campaign is called We Choose Freedom is because if we don't choose it, we're not going to have it much longer. We have to choose it, we have to stand behind it, and we have to realize the environmental movement, whatever it may have started out to be, wherever people's hearts are who may have joined it, because we all care about our environment, we need to realize it's a communist movement, address it as such, and sometimes you have to start over. And I believe that's where we are with the environmental movement and environmental education. We need to start over.
Right, we really do. I know that Alex Newman is now on the call on the radio show, and I wanted Alex. He's teaching classes right now, and he's very actively involved in education as well. And this is something that certainly Alex has got a really heads-up view of the whole political climate, the whole education environment. And I wanted to give Alex an opportunity to introduce himself to the show, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that he has been experiencing through the education system nationwide. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me, Dan, and hi again, Holly. It's
Hello.
great to hear your voice again. It's been too long. And thank you, Dan, for the opportunity to talk about these incredibly important topics. Yeah, actually, the reason I wasn't on for the first hour was because I had to teach a class, and we're down to the end of the year. My kids got a final, and I couldn't leave them hanging. So thank you for being willing to let me come on the second hour and skip the first. The way I see education now and with this environmentalism, I think it is the key tool of the establishment in pursuing its agenda, which, environmentalism is really just another tool, but it's a very convenient tool because it allows them to promote all these policies that they desire anyway. So when we understand that the end goal is totalitarianism, global government, total control, we see how education and the environment are each playing a key role in bringing this all about. Education, as I know Holly has been exposing for years, and I know I'm sure she was talking about that in the first hour, is being used to brainwash and indoctrinate our kids to accept all of this, including the environmental component of it. And then the environmentalism is serving as the pretext for a lot of the policies and for a lot of the brainwashing. So, they'll say, well, we have to, terrify your children, terrorize your children about global warming, because otherwise, nobody will be able and willing to deal with this planetary catastrophe, this alleged, man-made global warming that's going to toast us all unless you give all our money and all our freedom to the United Nations. So the two are pretty much inseparable. But I see education as even more crucial to this, because education is what they're using to weaponize the next generation against us. And actually, at the last Red Pill Expo, I used the metaphor of janissaries. Janissaries were, it's kind of a long story, but the Ottoman Empire, they would run raids into Christian Europe and kidnap children. They would kidnap Christian children from villages there, and they would take them back to the Ottoman Empire, and they would brainwash them and indoctrinate them. And then, these kids, they spoke the language of their home cultures. They understood the culture. They understood the religious views. They understood the land, the terrain, and all the rest of it. So these were incredibly valuable tools for the Ottoman Empire. They basically brainwashed them and turned them into an elite military corps, and then sent them back into Europe to go run raids and destroy cities and scout out and grab intelligence and things like that. And I think that's a very appropriate metaphor for what's actually going on in the government schools today. The only difference is that our children aren't being kidnapped. We're deliberately sending them there. And what's happening there in the schools is they are being thoroughly indoctrinated. They're being turned against liberty. They're being turned against their country. They're being turned against nationhood as we know it. They're being turned against God and our churches and biblical worldview. And then they're being sent back out into the culture, weaponized and turned against their parents, turned against liberty and all these things. And they're an incredibly effective weapon. I mean, David Hogg, I think, is just a brilliant example of this. I'm in Florida right now. He just staged these die-ins at the grocery store because Publix had given money to a political candidate that had an A from the NRA. So that's what we're dealing with now. Our children, the only difference is they're not being kidnapped. We're sending them voluntarily to be brainwashed, indoctrinated, and weaponized. And I think that's why the establishment is so cocky. They're so confident because they think they're going to win, right? They have 80 to 90% of the minds of the young people. And, how can you lose with that, right? Abraham Lincoln, even Adolf Hitler and Stalin, and all these people understood that the route to complete power was controlling the minds of the children. You also asked me to introduce myself briefly, Dan, so I'll do that. I'm the foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine. I blog about education at the Freedom Project. I teach for the Freedom Project Academy. I co-wrote a book on education. I'm actually working on another one right now. And, my biggest mission now is to expose what's going on in the schools, what's going on in the public schools, so that parents will do the right thing and pull their children out immediately.
Yeah, amen. And I have to mention that Ann Blake Tracy was on the radio show here not long ago talking about how the drug culture and how let's say are active and intelligent and maybe a little bit hyperactive, how they're being targeted and being drugged, and how so many of these kids are at the center of this classroom violence stuff that's going on. So between that and the violent video games and all the other stuff that are part of our culture, it's a wonder that these kids are doing as well as they are. It's absolutely amazing how many obstacles they put in front of them.
Yep, it really is. It goes even to the most basic level, Dan. We've talked about this on your show before. They're using a method of teaching reading that we've known is absolute quackery for 150 years, right? When they first tried it in the public schools in Boston under Horace Mann, it was exposed as absolute quackery. The headmasters of all the schools said, oh, my goodness, the kids are becoming illiterate. We can't possibly use this anymore. And so there was this big rebellion, and we didn't hear about it anymore until John Dewey came back and said, hey, that'll be perfect. And so that's why, even according to the government's own data, Americans cannot read. At Washington, D.C., you have more than 2/3 of the population is functionally illiterate, according to the government's own data. These are all victims of government school. So not only did they not receive an education, they were handicapped in such a way that they cannot even obtain an education now if they want to. They cannot open a book and read it because they were victimized by this quackery, this whole word method of teaching reading, to the point where they now cannot actually read. So even if they woke up one day and said, you know what, I want to learn about God's Word, I want to learn about the Constitution, I want to learn about the science of global warming, they wouldn't be able to do that. They could go to CNN or Fox News, pick your poison, but they couldn't actually read a book about it. They couldn't walk down to the library and get books on these things. So it's a huge problem, and it goes down to the very fundamentals of what education is. You ask any average person, what is education? They'll say, well, you got to teach the kids to read and write, and you got to teach them basic math, and none of that's happening anymore, right? It's actually so bad that it's now not only not happening, the opposite is happening. They're being prevented from learning how to read, and this is just evil beyond our wildest dreams.
And we're paying for it, and I just wanted to add to what you said, Alex, that one of the senators, state senator in Oregon, actually pointed out that in Oregon, when the students are entering community colleges and what have you, the courses they're taking are remedial courses, very basic courses, because they haven't learned it in public school, yet they are passed through and passed out, even though they don't know how to read and do basic math. And part of that, I believe, is because, as John Dewey pointed out, he wanted to see the schools become instruments for social change. In other words, use them to impose an agenda on the kids, and this is truly what we're seeing. And the idea to lower the voting age, which is now being promoted by a few, lower the voting age to 16 would even help the Green Movement and the Communist Movement achieve their goals sooner, because it would have more new voters voting sooner. If they were voting at 16, it would move it forward. So it all ties together. I agree completely with what you're saying, Alex.
Well, and we need to understand that part of the thinking behind all this stuff is it goes back through not just Common Core, but it goes back to all these education programs that really started in the first part of the 20th century. So this has been building. It's been building over a period of time. And really, both political parties are responsible for the dumbing down of America, but it's really accelerated since the 1960s. And I think, obviously, that is about the time that the environmental movement was born, although I guess they had a very similar movement in Nazi Germany. Debbie had that on her program a couple of weeks ago. But these programs are always designed to control people and control attitudes and ideas and learning. And I know my grandson goes to school in Ohio, and he came home a month and a half ago and informed my daughter that only 3,000 Jews had been killed in the Holocaust, and that all these other stories are just big lies. And she said, where did you learn that? And he said, well, it's in our history book. And she said, I want that history book. Well, they won't let the kids bring the books home anymore, because they don't want they don't want parents seeing exactly what their kids are being taught. That is just pretty much the whole story of our entire culture now. Alex, you see that on an ongoing daily basis. Tell us what our listeners to do. I know you want to get every kid in public education out of public education. Is there a way that we can do that and still work within the public education system?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to address this, Dan. And I think this is, the $50 million question, because, none of us can do everything, right? None of us can rewrite the laws in Congress. None of us can influence, really, the Department of Education at the U.S. government level, which, of course, completely dominates now what is taught in the classroom and all the rest of it. But one thing we can all do is protect our own kids. Get your kids out of the system. Stop feeding them to the beast. Stop handing them over to Caesar, right? Jesus told us pay our taxes to Caesar. He never said give your children to Caesar. So that's a very, very simple thing that everybody can do. And I'm sure somebody out there is already coming up with excuses for why they can't do it. Well, I don't have enough money. Well, how many cars do you drive? How many vacations do you go on every year? You can do it, and anybody can. So maybe you can't afford a nice, fancy private school. I can't either. But you can homeschool, right? And if you don't think you're qualified to homeschool, well, that's not going to work either, right? That excuse no longer will cut it anymore. First of all, no matter how bad you are, you'll do a better job than the government schools, right? And I say only half jokingly, you could put your kid in a closet for 18 years and they'd be better educated than they would be in the government schools, because at least they wouldn't know a whole bunch of stuff that's false. But seriously, there's so many tools out there now that can help parents to do this in a very cost-effective way. And one obvious example is the Freedom Project Academy, which I work for. I don't get any bonus for new students enrolling or anything. There's other options out there. I just use it as an example because it's one I'm familiar with. But for very low cost, I think for an elementary K through 12, I think you're looking at like $2,000 per year. You'll get a private Christian education, no Common Core, and it's all done through the internet. So we went from like 20 kids to I think more than 800 kids now over a period of 6 or 7 years, and it costs basically no money. Every parent can afford. Most parents can afford $2,000 a year to give their kids a good education, even if they can't necessarily afford $10,000 or $20,000 at an elite private school. And so that's one option, right? The kids will do school online. They'll do the homework, and you still need some parental supervision. Parents will still need to be involved. It won't be like the government's glorified babysitting service masquerading as government school, but it is an option out there for people. And there are now so many resources. I was at a homeschool convention this weekend. Just massive how many resources are available. There's all these online schools. There's all these pre-made curriculums. There's all kinds of stuff. And people say, well, I'm a single mom. I can't do it. I'm a single mom. Well, you know what? I challenge you on that excuse, too. We have single moms in our homeschool co-ops. It's really hard work. Sometimes they work 2 jobs. They have to, rely on grandma to help out and rely on friends to, I got to pick up an extra shift here. Can you watch my daughter? Okay, absolutely. So it's tough. Nobody said it was easy. But is the mind, the soul, and the body of your child not worth some sacrifice? And that's what I say to parents. You can come up with excuses, but, if you really set your mind to it, you can find a way to protect your child from this. And I think that is the key. And I know Holly, recognizes that we don't want to just abandon the kids in the government schools, and I agree. We need to do something about them as well. But the first and most obvious thing that a parent can do is to protect their own children. And, it's like a natural parental reaction, right? When your kids are under threat, the first thing you need to do is protect them. Then you can worry about, maybe helping other people, saving other people. But this is something everybody can do. Homeschooling is legal in all 50 states. If you've got a lot of money, you can send them to a good private school. But it's something that everybody can, and in my opinion, should do. And, we also have the added benefit that these kids who are being educated outside the system are light years ahead of the poor victims of the government schools. So, they can train up 50 zombies in the government brainwash camp, but, a homeschooler will be 50 times better than them at math. And so I like our odds. And I think parents need to really seriously consider that, pray about it, and, see if you aren't convicted and see if you aren't motivated to protect your kids.
And I think, Alex, just to say absolutely, where there's a will, there's a way. And there's so many options for homeschooling, whether it be through a church or neighborhood groups, there's tremendous option. And you're right, the homeschooled children are light years ahead of those in public schools. So we have a twofold opportunity to save our children, and where there's a will, there is a way.
Yeah, you're right, Ollie. One of the things that I read about is how the homeschool kids perform so much better in all the critical math and science and history and all the critical subjects, how much better homeschooled children perform than the public school system, and yet the tests are actually designed by the public school system. So that shows just exactly how bad that public school system is if they can design the tests and they can design the criteria, and the homeschoolers still end up way, way ahead of the public school students. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's a problem with the public school system.
Absolutely, and it's very important to understand, too, with what Alex was saying and what you've just mentioned about testing, just to interject, is the goal is to take the climate literacy agenda and make it a graduation requirement so that homeschool students would have to learn it as well, and in order to graduate or get into a school. So it isn't a graduation requirement nationwide yet, but that's why we need to tackle this, and the homeschooling is vitally important. We've got to tackle what's going on in education and find ways to, as Alex mentioned, absolutely protect the child. That's got to be the priority.
It does, because our children are the future of this country, and our children, as parents, if we're responsible parents, we have no higher responsibility than our children.
That's right.
All right. Well, Alex, we're moving into the break. We're going to be breaking just a few minutes, but I'd like you to talk about your book, Crimes of the Educators.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Dan. And you just hop in and tell me when to stop, because I could talk on this for many hours. But it actually dovetails nicely with what we've been talking about. One of the big players that we focus on in the book, and to give a brief summary of it, what we essentially argue is that the government school system has literally become a criminal enterprise, a criminal racket. And we say crimes of the educators, how utopians are using government schools to destroy America's children. Just to be clear, we're not talking about your average teacher. Yeah, some of them are leftists. Yeah, some of them are globalists. Some of them hate America and think all these bad things. But that's because they were brainwashed, too. Most of them went into education because they like kids, they love teaching, things like that. So just to be clear, we're not attacking teachers per se. But what we are attacking is this system. And we outline a series of crimes that we believe are being perpetrated, demonstrable crimes, crimes for which there's overwhelming evidence, crimes for which normal people would be prosecuted in a court of law. And I think we provide overwhelming documentation that this is criminal activity taking place and that it needs to be prosecuted. There's bumper music, so we'll maybe pick it up on the other side of the break. Huh?
We'll pick it up on the other side of the break. Keep that thought in mind, though, Alex.
Okay, excellent.
This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You don't really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. And try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now, I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And incidentally, I have to mention that last gentleman that spoke was a gentleman by the name of Stan Jones, who's a personal friend of mine. who ran for governor in the state of Montana, and that recording is from, I believe, 2004. So he had the guts to start talking about this back then, and at the time, a lot of people thought Stan had antenna growing out his ears and wore a tinfoil hat. Well, Stan was right on the money, and he had the guts to say it, so I applaud him in retrospect. But anyway, we'll get back to our discussion. I want to mention, too, that Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday is on tomorrow, same time, same station. And I want to mention that Jeff Bennett's Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz comes on immediately after our program. And he's got a terrific 2-hour program as well. So please join those folks, and please support this radio network. We need your help. We need your support to make sure that we get that satellite uplink in place that will literally make a difference of millions and millions of listeners in listenership once we get that in place. So with that, Alex, I get back to your discussion of the crimes of the educator and some of the things that you uncovered in your book.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Dan. And so I think where we left off, I was talking about how we basically outline a series of crimes that we believe the establishment behind the modern government education system is committing. And those range from extremely serious crimes, child abuse, for example. We consider it absolutely abusive to deliberately damage the minds of children. And these people know very well, the people who designed the system, they know full well that they're destroying the minds and the souls of children. Ranging down to the more mundane things like, drugging children, right? They mess up these kids in the head, and then they say, oh, I know your problem. You just need more amphetamines, right? And so they'll go prescribe them Adderall and Ritalin and all these other hard drugs that, if you were to sell them on the street, you'd go to jail. And, they're pushing it on 5-year-old, 6-year-old boys because they're bouncy and they can't read and all the rest of it. And then you have just things like, outright fraud and extortion, right? If any normal businessman was selling a product and, said, hey, it's going to do X, Y, Z, and then it actually did the opposite, then that person would be taken to court and probably criminally prosecuted for defrauding people, right? It'd be like selling snake oil and claiming it's going to cure your cancer when all it's going to do is make you die. I mean, people would say, hey, wait a minute here, that's not okay. And that's exactly what's going on, right? We're paying massive amounts of money through our taxes and at all levels of government, right, to support this system. And we're being told that this system is supposed to educate children. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. Not only does it not educate them, as we discussed before the break, it prevents them from even being able to educate themselves. And so one of the things we really focus on is the use of what's called the whole word, and they try to conceal it now under different terms because parents started getting wise to it. The look-say method, now they call it the sight word method, right? If you read the Common Core standards in kindergarten, they'll tell you one of the kindergarten standards is that the kids need to memorize lists of sight words. And, you can find these lists on the internet. You have the bilch words, the fry words, all these different lists of sight words the kids are supposed to memorize. And, to condense 50 years of my co-author's research into, a soundbite, basically they're teaching these kids to read English as if it were Chinese. So instead of teaching them the sounds of the letters, and, each letter represents one or more sounds, and here's how you decode these things, like a P is for, P, like Paul or Pat or something like that, you teach them to look at a whole word as if it were a symbol in and of itself, like as if it were a Chinese character, right? So you look at the word cat, and instead of reading a C that makes a K sound and an A that makes an sound and a T that makes a T sound and putting them together to read cat, you look at the symbol, or the 3 symbols, you look at them all as one symbol that you should understand as cat. So we have a phonetic writing system, right? That means that our writing system is based on representing sounds with symbols. But what they're teaching the kids is to memorize entire words as if the words themselves were symbols. So this causes enormous damage to the children. It was actually originally developed by a reverend who was helping take care of deaf children, and deaf children can't hear sounds, and so this was a logical way to try to teach deaf children to do some basic reading. And in that sense, it was successful because otherwise these kids couldn't have read anything. And an average mind can remember a good amount of symbols, right? So you can teach kids to memorize 100, 1,000, maybe even 2,000 symbols, and they'll be able to read some things by just memorizing the whole word. But then what happens when you get to a word that you've never read before, right? There's many thousands of words in the English language, and there's no way somebody could remember them all. So you end up with this massive problem where kids can kind of read some basic stuff. Some just end up totally illiterate, right? They become dyslexic and all these other things, and they can't read much of anything. And others, struggle. They might be able to read very, very simple books like See, Spot, Run, Spot, Run, right? The Dick and Jane series. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this was exposed as a total fraud, as total quackery 150 years ago. And then along came John Dewey with Rockefeller money, right? And of course, Rockefeller is the big financiers of the environmental movement as well, right? I did an article on this in the New American some years ago, where basically the entire environmental movement is a creation of the Rockefeller dynasty. So the Rockefellers, John D. Rockefeller, put together what they call the General Education Board, which was a supposed philanthropy, and they gave millions of dollars to John Dewey, who's the architect of our current government school system. And you can read his writings. I mean, he was pretty blunt about, the purpose of education was to socialize children and get them to, see themselves as a part of the community rather than individuals. And, we don't need to teach little kids reading and math and those things. We just need to get them socialized. So he gave millions to Dewey and helped Dewey take a very prestigious spots at, the Columbia University's education department and the University of Chicago's education department. So he became incredibly powerful. They took over these colleges of education. They trained up an army of people who believed like they did in terms of what is education about, how do you teach reading and all the rest of it. They fanned out across the country and basically took a sledgehammer to what had before that been, a pretty decent system of education across the country and replaced it with this monster that, we have today. It took a long time to get us here, but his ideology was very, very clear. He wanted to use the government education system to, as Barack Hussein Obama put it, fundamentally transform this country. He wanted it to be a socialist, communist country. He told us so. Right? He thought Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy would be a good model, a communist America with no private property. He was one of the co-signers and drafters of the first Humanist Manifesto, which, right at the very beginning says, we believe the universe is eternally self-existing and not created. Right? You can compare that with the Bible right in the beginning. In the beginning, God created. And this has implications for our liberty, too. Right? Our founder said it was a self-evident truth that we were created and that God created us equal and that God gave us inalienable rights. Well, if we're not created, we don't have a creator who gave us inalienable rights. Well, it's a ludicrous idea. If we're not created, we don't have inalienable rights. And so that's why, even from a liberty perspective, even beyond just corrupting the morals and destroying the souls of children, if you value your own liberty, you need to take this seriously, because once you remove the creator, you no longer have any external source to hang your rights on. So that's what we're dealing with here. It's a criminal system that exists primarily for indoctrinating the children, and the end result of this is going to inevitably be global totalitarianism if we don't take urgent action to stop it.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right, Alex. And one of the comments that you made about the Rockefellers, the Rockefeller Foundation has been at the really at the forefront of all these social engineering programs. They are really leading the pack, and one has to remember that there's a term called Rockefeller Republicans. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is an issue of freedom, and we've had progressive socialists in both parties at the very highest echelons of leadership in those parties for a very long time. And if you look at who make up the Republican and the Democratic parties, it's a wonder that Trump has been able to accomplish anything with his administration, because so many of these deeply entrenched people like, there's quite a few of them, but Jeff Flake and also John McCain in Arizona, I mean, they couldn't be further from the Constitution if they tried. And these are the people that are making up the hierarchy of much of the Republican Party, and people like that or worse are making up all of the Democrat Party. We've really got to do something about this whole thing. And I think both of you have done an excellent job of explaining how this isn't one area, it isn't one thought, it isn't one problem. It's the whole mess put together, and they are attacking our children. They are trying to steal our children's minds for the future. And we've got to do everything in our power to make sure that the blessings of parenthood, that we protect those children.
Absolutely.
Holly, yeah, go ahead. Holly, I'd like to get you back in the conversation here, too, because you've obviously got some really strong feelings about this as well. And based on the crimes of the educator, I know your book, really, Training for Treason, is very much the same kind of book. It shows how so many of these movements are supposedly one thing, but they're actually something totally different.
Absolutely, and it just, what you were talking about with the Rockefellers and education, it's important to note also when you look at the fact that this is all one big movement working toward the same thing, even though they're different pieces. The Rockefellers have been and are very involved with funding Gorbachev and the Earth Charter, right smack in there, right from the beginning. And as we look at Training for Treason, as it goes along with this, one of the things that Training for Treason, I believe, a very important aspect of that is to have people be able to look at the direct quotes, what John Kerry said, what Gorbachev said, what the Green Party stands for, and be able to read those quotes side by each to understand the political goal behind them. And I think that's a tremendous resource. It is about just a little over 100 pages long, but it also helps do something else that I think is important to mention. In the back of the book, there are about 50 pages dedicated to identifying state by state by state what environmental groups, what groups in general, have endorsed the Earth Charter, what groups are behind this philosophy, behind the idea of taking over our schools, behind the idea of a communist form of government. And that's very important because it helps people be able to look at the groups in their own state, in their own backyard, and the reality of what's happening, it really brings it into focus, I believe. And, you can get the book at just basically any bookstore, Amazon, wherever. And I would encourage reading it, just like The Crimes of the Educators, because we have to be informed as we go forward to tackle this. And you're absolutely right. It's urgent that we tackle it.
We have to protect our children and our grandchildren, and really there's no one else to do that. The system is designed to steal their minds. If the parents and the grandparents don't step forward, there's no one else that is there to really secure the blessing of liberty for those young people.
No, and it's important, too, to understand that these resources, Crimes of the Educators, Training for Treason, are very important because the schools, it points out what's happening. These books point out what's happening because our schools are not what they were when grandparents were attending. It's completely different. I think it would shock most people. Alex, would you agree? Somebody
absolutely.
Going in?
Yeah, and I think that's a crucial thing for people to understand because, people who are from, the generation before mine or even before that, well, I went to school and we prayed and we learned how to read. And, but the schools are a lot different now, right? Today, rather than teaching you history, they're teaching you that there's infinite numbers of genders and that homosexuality is awesome and that, American founding fathers were evil, genocidal racists who just wanted to destroy everything. So people need to realize that the schools of today are not the schools of 20 years ago. They're certainly not the schools of 40 years ago, and they're light years away from what was happening 50, 60, 70 years ago. And you can show objectively that the American people are being dumbed down in these schools. I mean, it's not even a subject that can be debated. You can look at the SAT scores from the 60s, and you can show that the dumb kids back in the 60s were smarter than the smart kids today. They keep recentering the SAT to try to conceal this, but you can find the documentation of what they've done, and you can demonstrate objectively that kids are getting dumber and dumber and dumber. So parents need to realize. And then there's also this myth out there that, oh, that doesn't happen in my school district.
Exactly.
Oh, yes, it does. Right? They're all reading from the same playbook. It's coming from Washington, D.C., and now beyond that, it's coming from UNESCO, as you show in Crimes of the Educators, as I've documented very, very extensively in the New American magazine. I just put out an article, I think 2 months ago in the New American that ended up getting a lot of attention. UNESCO now has sex education standards. They want them in every school on the planet. Every child in the world needs to start learning about sex at age 5. Right? They want this infused in every element of the curriculum, in math and science and history and all across. And we're seeing this in the United States now. In California now, even the history textbooks have to promote the LGBT nonsense. And people need to realize that things have changed a lot from when you were in school. It's getting worse very, very quickly, and this is all well documented. It's not something that you can say, well, my opinion is different. We're not talking about opinions. We're talking about facts here. And if you value the mind, the heart, the soul, and even the physical body of your child, you must get informed on these things, and you must take action to protect your own kids and to protect the kids around you.
Absolutely. And what you said, and I think it's vital to understand when we're looking at schools of yesteryear and where the schools are now, it is absolutely brainwashing every subject, every day, just as a communist model of education. The sustainability goals, the green goals, the social justice goals, the sexual goals, starting from preschool, with a 5-year-old child, and then taking it and making it part of history and part of math. There's no way for the child to escape the indoctrination process, and that's the idea. And just quickly from page 103 of Training for Treason, this is from a book, Communism, What It Is and How It Works, 1964. The quote is, in the USSR, only one point of view, Marxism, Leninism, is permitted, and teachers are expected to present it to their pupils. For this reason, even sentences used to teach principles of grammar, word problems in arithmetic, and many others all serve to reinforce communist ideology. And this is exactly what's happening in our schools to this day, to this moment. That is a change, to take every subject every day and indoctrinate the child in the agenda of communism. It's very serious.
Very serious. I have to tell you that I'm reading a book called Disinformation by Lieutenant General Ian Pacepa, and that book is he was the most highly decorated, highest military officer to ever defect to the United States. And he was talking in the book about how the disinformation the communists use to attack their opponents and how they can sell something that's totally the opposite of what the truth is and how they do it. And when I'm reading through this, and they were attacking Pope Pius the 12th as a Nazi collaborator, when in fact he was probably the most anti-Nazi or an anti-fascist of the church members anywhere in the world at the time. And yet they've attacked him and tried to show him as being a Nazi sympathizer. And the way they were describing how they did it, it sounded so much like the court system and what has been happening in the U.S. to the Bundys, to the Hammonds, to all these people who are trying to protect their private land, trying to protect their way of life. And it sounds like the communist government in Yugoslavia and in Russia, the things that they did, it mirrors exactly what's been happening in our court system in this country. So it's literally every single thing we see and do is being impacted by this indoctrination, by this disinformation, as it were. So I want to mention the fact that you're a young man, and you were at least partially homeschooled, and you are probably as the product of as good an education and one of the most well-rounded young men that I've ever met in my life. You are teaching now, and what you are teaching is the sense of independence that you learned when you were a very young man, and like I say, you're still a very young man in my view. Tell our listeners how important religion, how important the Christian church, how important a focus on something besides humanism is for the education of our youth.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. And, I have to admit, I was actually a victim of secular humanist education. And, in fact, it nearly drove me over the edge. I'm a living testament to the evil effects of atheistic, humanistic education, where you're taught that, you came from slime that turned into fish, that turned into monkeys, that turned into humans. I mean, the consequences of this permeate every aspect of your life. I mean, it is at the heart of your worldview. Where did we come from? What is our purpose in life? If you're taught, as every child in a government school today is being taught, that they came from slime, that evolution is a fact, that your life is essentially no more valuable than a goldfish, it's all just a big cosmic accident, and there is no purpose to life, you end up going over the edge. You see kids shooting up their schools. You see this explosion of suicide among children, right? 50 years ago, there was no such thing as, suicide of children. A school shooting was basically unheard of. It's just completely out of the question. But when you brainwash the kids to think this way, there is no purpose to life. There is no value to life. It's easy then to go turn around and murder your unborn child in an abortion. And it affects everything. From a liberty perspective, I touched on this too. If you have no creator, then certainly it's not a self-evident truth that your creator gave you rights. And, when I say this, people say, well, you just want to promote your religion in schools. No, that's not what I'm saying, right? We don't need to promote my particular religious doctrines in a government school. But I think we need to agree that, the founder said it was a self-evident truth. And it is a self-evident truth. And this is clear to anybody who hasn't been brainwashed. If you look at children, there's actually been studies on this. Children, no matter where in the world they're born, they come into the world with an understanding that they were created and that their creator was good and all-powerful and all-knowing. These are just things that are in us, and it takes serious brainwashing. Or as Romans 1:18-22 tells us, you have to deliberately suppress the truth in your unrighteousness to not realize, because God has made it all plain to us, right? He has made himself plain to us through his creation. The heavens declare his glory. And yet in every government school in this country, they're being taught as fact something that is demonstrably not fact, something that is in fact ridiculous, something that is a lie straight from the pit of hell. And the consequences for this are so tragic. It's going to destroy our society. It's going to destroy civilization. And, I know that's blunt, and I know to some people that's going to sound wild, but that's just how I see it, and I'm going to call it like I see it.
Yeah, you have to, Alex. Well, it sounds like we're moving into our last break and the end of the program, but I wanted to thank Alex Newman and Holly Swanson for being our guests today, and we had a great discussion on the indoctrination of our youth. Please join us again next week and connect the dots for yourself, folks. Connect the dots. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.